Okay, Stuart, thank you very much. We are now going to start our panel discussion. And to lead it off, though, I'd like to turn to Eric Rubin, our speaker, who is going to represent an industry perspective on this policy topic, was unable to participate at the last minute. So Eric has graciously offered to provide his thoughts on policy from his perspective. So Eric?
Thanks, Monica. So the previous sessions of this workshop have been very helpful in understanding the barriers to enrollment of older patients in clinical trials and why the age distribution often does not match that of the disease population. These include barriers relevant to the patient, caregivers, physicians, and industry. Having served as a phase 1 clinical trial oncologist in academia for many years, it was rare for my colleagues to refer a patient over 75 to me for consideration of enrollment in one of my trials, and the issue of physician bias as an important barrier has been noted. There have also been interesting proposed solutions, and the clinical trials discussed in the last session provide important examples of approaches that have been successful, including registrational intent industry-sponsored studies. In particular, including an extension cohort or a subsequent study with relaxed eligibility criteria once there are safety and efficacy data from patients enrolled under what might be called standard eligibility criteria seems to be an approach that does not slow down drug development, but enables evaluation of safety and efficacy in older patients. Dr. Sridhara also outlined modified intention to treat approaches that would allow obtaining information from older frail patients in phase 3 studies without potentially jeopardizing demonstration of risk benefit for a new agent in a healthier population. Similar to efforts to address legacy restrictive eligibility criteria, and these were just nicely described by Dr. Lichtman, as well as current efforts to increase enrollment of medically underserved population in clinical trials, I believe my industry colleagues would be welcome participants in discussions with other stakeholders represented at this meeting, including discussions related to policy opportunities. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Eric, very much. So let me just start this off. So this session focuses on policy changes that can get us over this hump. I think we've all decided we know what we need to do. We know it's important. We know how to do it. We saw great examples from our colleagues in the last session about how this is getting data for older cohorts is possible. It's been well accepted. There have been a couple decades now of serious development and research gone into it. Why isn't it happening? And how do we get over the hump? And is it time for both carrots and sticks from a policy perspective, since it doesn't seem to be bubbling up naturally from just developing a lot of good tools? So maybe we can ask our panelists to address this. And I guess what we can do is maybe start from the last to the first. So Stu, do you want to start? Why haven't we gotten where we need to do, and what would specifically you call for to make it happen?
I mean, to some degree, it's almost inexplicable to me. So after doing this 30 years, and I'm in the same boat that Rich is, as you get older, it's even more important. And actually, I'm even a cancer survivor, and I've been on, I've signed consent forms for studies. So I get it. I get the whole thing, but I just don't understand the reluctance. I mean, for all the reasons you said, and I think the only way, from a regulatory point of view, you want to get a drug approved, you have to do these things that we talked about. They can't be required. I mentioned the journal thing again. Maybe I'm just barking up the wrong tree on that one. But if some high impact journal said, you can't publish this without at least some descriptor or some analysis of how older patients are doing on your study, they'll do it. Most of these analyses don't cost anything extra, but it isn't being done either. Read any random issue of any high impact journal you want. I'm telling you, it's not there. But from an FDA point of view, you just got to say it's got to be done. It just has to happen. I don't know how that works. I'm not a politician. I know FDA is mandated. The rules are regulated by Congress. They can't, but they could, as I said, they could be more stringent. They spend the time and effort to have these publications, guidance for this and guidance for that. but it seems to fall on deaf ears. So I don't know, besides guidances, what else you could do, unless it's mandated. I just don't see how. We've done research now for almost 40 years on this area. So what's it going to take? Maybe we should have a riot at the FDA. Or no, I'm just kidding. Don't quote me on that. No, but I'm just toward the end of my career, I'm getting very.
Let me stop you right there. Let me stop you right there, Stu. My God.
I know. Okay. I'm just getting very agitated at the end of my career here. I just want to see something happen. It's a little frustrating.
So Eric, maybe I can direct one more, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. So Aaron, you've described when legislation steps in, and maybe you could just discuss a little bit about, some ideas. If new legislation were to come, what would it look like? What should it say? And what would unintended consequences be if we said you have to produce data that represents the demographics of the disease, or you can't market your drug? I mean, what would the unintended consequences be there?
Yeah, so I think that first of all, if you're following the news in the last couple of days, you can understand how complicated and challenging it can be to get legislation done, even legislation that appears to be clearly in the best interests of everybody. I think that there is a one pathway, of course, would be to try to develop new legislation in the sort of a geriatrics equivalent to PREA that would put certain requirements on manufacturers before the drugs are FDA approved. I think that is, as I said, I think that is going to be challenging to get through, but I do also think that there is an opportunity coming up in the Prescription Drug User Fee Act reauthorization in 20 past piece of legislation, and it's usually an opportunity for the pharmaceutical industry to hang on all different kinds of additional fun little ornaments on that bill. This might be an opportunity for clinicians or patient advocates to try to step forward and to try to add that onto there. I think short of that, there are I think the FDA has a bit more flexibility under the current rules to at least be more clear about in the labeling of a drug about when these studies haven't been done and what it is that we should be telling, sort of suggestions about what patients, how to communicate with patients about the fact that these studies haven't been done. And if you're prescribing a drug, it's important to tell a patient that, look, here's a drug that hasn't really been tested in people of your, with your age and comorbidities, but we're going to give it a try anyway. That kind of conversation is, first of all, important. Just in the scheme of normal patient-doctor discussions, but I think it also helps educate physicians and educate patients about the fact that why aren't these studies done, and why am I going to spend $200,000 on a drug that hasn't been tested in my population? I don't know if it's gonna work or not, and that can help build some of the demand for trying to make sure that these studies get done, and for changing things like again. The NIH funding for this kind of work and other kinds of issues.
Great, thanks. So Eric, why don't you go ahead and we'll let you lead off.
So maybe I'll ask one for Rich, who of course has been involved in, as you mentioned, in this topic for quite some time. And I was also, and he was involved in efforts again that have been mentioned around reducing restrictive eligibility criteria that are legacy criteria that under modern anti-cancer treatments could be questioned whether these were really needed. And I think as have been discussed in some part, these actually may be excluding older patients. I'm not aware that these have actually been carried out into policy, but maybe they have. But I would say I do think that effort has had an impact. I know that for some of our trials, we've now relaxed, what would have been, I would say, standard historical eligibility criteria that probably aren't really needed. And I'll also just comment, and maybe if Harpreet's on, she can comment. I know that, we've started to see questions during IND submissions, for example, that say, hey, we've noticed that you're excluding HIV positive patients. You need to tell us why you're doing this. because otherwise we would highly recommend that this be done. And I again, while this is not, I think a policy directed effort, this is within FDA's current mandate. I think this is actually having an effect. So maybe just ask Rich and maybe again Harpreet if they'd like to comment on this.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Well, I think it is having an effect. I certainly hope so. And, of course, the tangible result of the work that ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research did and published was both a change in the NCI-CTEP protocol template for clinical trials to incorporate those recommendations, and then several guidance documents issued by FDA to support those recommendations, if you will. And, as you mentioned, we've heard also, and certainly Harpreet can discuss this, that FDA is asking sponsors, if they are excluding patients without justification, why they're doing that. I just heard earlier today on a call with NCI that NCI is doing the same thing in their protocol reviews for NCTN protocols, where they're trying to at least ask for justification for exclusion of populations where it's not clearly written in the protocol. So, we're hopeful that, as time goes by, we will see that these recommendations are having an impact, not only on the enrollment criteria, but actually on the populations of people who are in fact enrolled in the clinical trials. That's the end game, is to see that the populations enrolled are actually more representative of the population for which the product or treatment is intended. But while I have the floor, I wanted to come back for a minute to a couple of other policy things, maybe pick up a little bit on a comment that Aaron made. So, I do think that number one, the FDA has signaled very clearly in this workshop and and through other ways that they are very interested in this area. They're very willing to work with sponsors to help them to enroll representative populations in clinical trials. I think that's all good. It seems to me that the drug label is both a very powerful carrot as well as a powerful stick. On the carrot side, right? So if the sponsor actually develops sufficient information that they can really write an informative drug label about the safety and effectiveness of their drug in older people, that's a great thing for that sponsor. They can market it, they can direct to consumer advertise it, they can talk to doctors about it, and they can point out that they have this information and their competitors don't. There's also, it seems to me, a potential stick, which would be very controversial and would require, I think, multiple parts of the system to come together, which is to say that, if older people are not adequately represented in the NDA submission, the indication for the drug could actually be limited to exclude the older patients from being able to receive the drug. Now, obviously, that puts a huge segment of the population that could potentially benefit from the treatment at a disadvantage. It may well be the case, though, that by working with, say, CMS and third-party payers to invoke this sort of coverage with evidence development strategy, that we could have the best of all possible worlds if we could actually get these different government agencies to work together. So FDA might, at least provisionally, in some way limit the drug label pending the development of additional information. The additional information could then be developed from larger, simpler trials, essentially studying the drug off-label in the older population, but with agreement from Medicare to cover that off-label use so that the patients are not at financial risk for receiving the drug off-label, and the relevant data is acquired during the off-label use. So I'll just throw that out there maybe to prompt a little bit of further discussion. And the last thing I'll say, just to come back to one of the things I mentioned briefly in my talk, it's been obvious to those of us who've been working in this area for a long time that the physician is the linchpin in this whole discussion. If the physician does not recommend that the older patient participate in a trial, it's not going to happen. And that is the reason that ASCO has sort of endorsed this idea, which ASCO didn't develop. This idea about having a CPT code for managing patients, older patients on clinical trials, actually all patients on clinical trials, came out of the 2010 IOM report on reorganizing the national clinical trial system. And there was, if you look carefully in there, it is in that report, and it basically reinforces the notion that doctors have to spend a lot more time managing patients who are on clinical trials than patients who are not on clinical trials, and they don't get paid anything more to do it. And in fact, many would argue that they lose money when they manage patients on clinical trials because they could see 3 times as many patients, who are off trial compared to one patient who's on trial. So, this is another policy change that has not gotten a lot of traction. It has to start with the AMA. They're the owners of those CPT codes, and then those codes have to be reimbursed at an appropriate and we think higher level. But I think that's something that still merits further discussion and advocacy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rich. So maybe now we could turn to Rebecca. And Rebecca, your talk was just so intriguing. It is unethical to not develop an evidence base for our older and more frail citizens. I think you brought that home to us. So do you have any other comments from your approach as to what's the best way to right this deficit?
Yeah, good point. And as an ethicist, I might have a little different perspective. And and I think Rich hit it right. It's the investigators we have to reach. I mean, obviously we have to reach lots of different things, but one of the key things is reaching the investigators. And to change ethics, you have to change character. And to change character, you can use the mentoring techniques. And what are a couple that might work here? One is to overcome the barriers they think, like Rich was talking about. There are barriers to enrolling patients in trials, but maybe we could just show that data from the last panel. Look, these trials are done. They were successful. We can make it happen. The barriers aren't there. So remove some of the barriers. And then that's the carrot. Then the stick is sometimes people will change their behavior if they really understand the harm of what they're doing, right? And so we need real clear data, not having, I gave suggestions in my talk, but with real clear data that not having this evidence actually harms patients. And I think that would go to an investigator physician's heart. They're there because they care for their patients. And if they thought not having this evidence was going to harm them, then they would go, oh, well, then okay, we'll do it. Those are just 2 ideas from an ethicist perspective.
So maybe I'll ask one for Sue. Again, greatly enjoyed your talk, Sue. Maybe you could comment on, again, the areas where you think, again, the carrot and the stick approach might work, as well as there's a comment from Heidi that notes that she's asking about advice regarding best practices to engage the public, including patients, caregivers, family members, to increase awareness and advocacy. And she notes that her older patients all seem surprised when she tells them that no studies have included someone their age.
That's a great question. I guess I would say a couple of things. I'm going to throw out the M word again for mandate, which I know folks are very hesitant and they say, oh, no, but you can't go that far. And I just want to remind a couple of the folks that spoke on the panel that we're excited to hear about changes at NCI and other places within NIH. That happened due to mandated language in 21st Century Cures. So this will create a level playing field with the industry. All the movement that all of you have done for so many years is fantastic. The next and real final step is let's just get it in writing. Let's just get a mandate down, make all the companies do it together. The geriatric medicine strategy, I can't tell you, a couple of the major cancer companies have told me in sidebar conversations on this, we're already doing this in Europe. We know how to do it. We could do it here. We just don't have to. So if we made it a have to, they would do it. And that's the point at which we're at. The other thing I wanted to mention was Dr. Shilsky mentioned the use of coverage with evidence development at CMS. And I just wanted to point out that if that were something that groups decided to pursue, I really want to put an emphasis on if it's a specialty society or some other group that is organizing the registry, that they actually publish information on the registry in a timely fashion, and that it be something that patients take part in deciding what type of information is reported. Because CED is used a lot for medical devices, and there's been a lot of problems with the specialty societies that have managed those registries in not, reporting data in a timely fashion, not linking it to health outcomes at all. And, really, it's just sort of a moneymaker for the specialty society. So as long as it's not that, and it's something that is meant to serve, the interest of science and ultimately patients, then I think it'll be beneficial. And to answer the question that came in, there's a lot of work being done in best practices at PCORI. You can do a search on the cancer-related studies for communication, for patient engagement, on cancer within PCORI and see what's been published. And if you have a research question that you feel like they would be good to do work in or to fund, you can actually submit something and they'll respond to it, or reach out to our group because we're a big advocate with PCORI and we're happy to pass it along.
Fantastic.
Go
ahead.
I just wanted to go ahead.
Sorry. I wanted to just riff off a comment I see in the chat from Don Harvey about dosing, and just to throw out another idea. Drug companies obviously, when they're developing new agents, have an opportunity to offer compassionate use of that agent, which typically is done after the NDA is submitted, but before the regulatory approval comes through. And that provides both, a way of for individuals to access the treatment, but also it may be a way to learn something about the treatment. And here I'm not talking about single patient IND. I'm talking about compassionate use protocols, which can enroll larger numbers of individuals. And since there are frequently questions about optimal dosing of drugs in older patients, it seemed to me there might be an opportunity when the NDA is submitted for a company to set up a compassionate use protocol that would provide access of the drug to older people and explore a dosing question, maybe even do a randomized study within a compassionate use protocol looking at different doses, so that while the FDA review is ongoing, we could actually continue to learn something about how to use the drug optimally in older people.
Great. Fantastic. Aaron?
I just wanted to also just follow up on the comment about the mandatory issue, and I do think that that's an important consideration. If sort of would be very valuable to make this kind of work mandatory. I think that the pushback you'd get kind of politically is that, well, what are you going to delay approval of the drug because there's 5% older adults in the trial and not 10% older adults trial. This drug looks like it works, and I think that was the rationale for why the mandatory requirement for testing drugs in children in PREA had this waiver out clause. And I think that unfortunately what's happened is that the waivers have kind of swallowed up the rule, and the delay in getting the trials done, if there is a waiver, is unfortunately too long in some circumstances. So I do think that moving towards a mandatory, again, given the fact that a lot of these drugs, unlike with pediatric patients, a lot of these drugs are approved and then will be used in a majority of older patients, making these kinds of trials mandatory might be useful, but again, you might have to include the waiver, and this is why I thought that, or a waiver option, and this is why I thought that it might be useful to try to consider whether the FDA should be re-reviewing these drugs after a certain amount of years on the market and ask, well, has there been real, sort of rigorous data collected about the use of these drugs in the patients in which they're being used a majority of the time? And if not, why not? And if the answers are acceptable, then they can help, adjust the labeling in that way. or they can try to, again, ask like what's going on. And I just think it's another incentive that helps make sure that these trials get done.
Yeah, maybe Eric, maybe I could call upon my co-moderator as our industry representative during this session about what are your thoughts on hearing, both of these, and especially, the compassionate use approach as during a review, and how do you think that would be accepted?
Yeah, well, I think, again, there is some precedent. I think again, it goes back to sort of relaxing eligibility criteria. Again, I think as has been pointed out, there's typically not an upper age limit in an industry-sponsored study. So it's not like these patients are being purposefully excluded just because of age. It's for other reasons. And again, some of it is, again, I think, beyond the eligibility criteria, we again talked about physician bias, maybe those patients aren't even being offered the clinical trial. But I think there is precedent for relaxing eligibility criteria in a compassionate use situation to try to enroll those patients. And again, I think if that's related to dose, again, the dose discussion, I think there was a nice discussion on that at the previous session last week. Again, I think there are multiple factors there. Age may be one, but again, it's back to things like renal function, other types of organ dysfunction that can occur with age, but isn't necessarily linked to a specific age group.
Okay, great. Other social factors. I see in the chat here a fair amount of discussion about overcoming resistance by trying to incentivize this is from Martine, incentivizing drug companies to support post-marketing investigator-initiating trials that target older patients. Anybody have any idea about what those incentives could be? We've talked about label, we've talked about exclusivity. I don't know, Martine, if you're on, do you want to chime in on this one?
Yes, I can. All right. Yeah. So I think there are various ways of incentivizing Iit. One, usually the drug companies, if they like an idea that will provide more knowledge of their drugs or a new indication in a rare disease or things like that, are willing to support Iits. I think, for example, one thing you could do is offer some, parallel funding, like, to support basic science data or translational science data on biologic frailty, on how do I identify the risk factors for toxicity from the drug. So if there could be a co-sponsoring mechanism or one of these, your money will pay double type of, like charities do, so like some pool of money where people could dig, the drug companies put some, and then there would be some science-driven aspects that could be added.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. Eric, do you want to go next?
Well, I noticed, I think in the chat, there's also, I think, an interesting area. I briefly mentioned this, that maybe I can just throw it out there as a more general question, which I think, in part because of things that are happening in the world these days, there's been a lot of focus on improving inclusion of underrepresented minorities in clinical trials, including industry trials. And I know our company has started to put more efforts into this. I think there are some similarities here, again, in that I don't think there's any purposeful exclusion of such patients. It's just that at least from an industry perspective, oftentimes we tend to use the same sites for our trials. These often are not necessarily community-based sites, again, because sometimes these sites they're not set up to participate in the the rigor and regulatory requirements around participating in a clinical trial. But I think that again, there's efforts now to get beyond that and to try to find ways to improve diversity in clinical trials. So I'll just open it up to the panel to wonder if those are ongoing now, and I think that there's a lot of interest now. Again, is there an opportunity to use that as well to help enroll older patients?
This is Rich. I'll just mention, obviously the issues are in many ways analogous. Older people are an underrepresented minority population in clinical trials, just the same way other underrepresented populations are in clinical trials. The specifics may differ, of course, a little bit, depending upon the precise population. This is a big area of interest to ASCO right now, and as I think many of you know, Lori Pierce, our president, has made health equity a major issue of her presidency. And we have a collaboration ongoing with the Association of Community Cancer Centers, the ACCC, to develop a strategy to help improve enrollment of underrepresented minorities in clinical trials. And it looks like the initial focus of that is going to be to create an assessment tool that sites can use to actually self-evaluate their readiness, their ability, their patient population, their capacity to enroll minority populations in clinical trials. And that would at least reveal to them what their potential deficiencies are and help them remedy those. So stay tuned. There'll be more rolling out on that on that initiative over the course of this year.
The other thing I wanted to throw in here along the lines of incentivizing enrolling, when you have an issue of potential unconscious bias. One, and it also speaks to what Efrat said, this little comment she said when she said, my investigators were really happy to have a protocol for the people that they actually see in clinic. Well, it's clear that we're actually seeing people in clinic who are eligible for our trials, but for one reason or another, we're not putting them on. Older people, we're not putting them on. So, the other approach is to say that, it's a screening tool listing everybody who meets eligibility criteria. And then if you don't put them on, you need to check a little box why, and if that maybe would cause some of our investigators to at least give it another look for, why am I excluding this otherwise fairly fit 80-year-old person from going on this trial? More of a direct awareness campaign. Okay. And I just going to comment, Rebecca, do you want to comment on what I just described about the tracking?
Yeah.
I saw your comment in the chat.
That's actually one of my jobs, or I've made it one of my jobs, is I track in real time which groups are underrepresented at Winship Cancer Institute in clinical trials. So I can go back to the investigators and say, you're doing great with African Americans, not so great with some other group. What are we going to do as a team to include that? And I'll have to admit, to my shame, I have never done older adults until I was put part of this workshop. It certainly will be on my tracking from now on. So I appreciate the being enlightened in an area that I was not enlightened in.
All right. Well, I don't know. Eric, do you have any other burning questions? Otherwise, we might wind this down.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to, remind you all that we will have another very interesting discussion coming up on Wednesday that will tackle some of these same type policy issues. It'll just be shifting from the actual trials themselves, the trials situation, to the post-market setting. So some of these themes will reemerge when we go to that session. Just reminding you all and hope we will see you participate. The final segment of the workshop is planned for this Wednesday. It starts at 8 a.m. this time instead of later in the day. Session 4 is opportunities to improve the evidence base for older adults in the post-marketing context. And then at the very end, this is why all asking for the carrots and the sticks and the specific recommendations, because the final session will reconvene all of our moderators and summarize the key messages and have what we hope to be a rigorous discussion of what a real action plan should be to go forward. And I think today we've heard in this discussion certainly some interesting directions that that action plan might actually take. So with that, I really thank everyone who participated in today's session. And again, thanks to our colleagues at the National Academies for making it possible for us to meet today. And we look forward to seeing everybody on Wednesday. Thank you so much.